for being here. Hello. I appreciate that everyone's joining us here for the third webinar in this series on intersectionality. My name is Amanda Ghahremani. I'm an international criminal lawyer and consultant based in Canada and a member of the Emergent Justice Collective, which is co-sponsoring this event. I'm delighted to be here today with a brilliant group of women to discuss how to enhance cooperation and representation among international criminal justice actors. Before I unpack exactly what that means and what our goals are for this session, I'd like to briefly introduce our wonderful panelists. For the sake of time, I'll be abbreviating their very long list of accomplishments, but please have a look in the chat as we speak, where you'll be able to access everyone's longer professional biography. I'll be doing this alphabetically, so let's begin with Angela. Angela is an experienced Zimbabwean human rights lawyer specialized in international criminal law. She has worked in a variety of geographical contexts and with diverse institutions ranging from Human Rights Watch to the Open Societies Foundations, the International Criminal Court, and the Southern Africa Litigation Center, to name just a few. Angela is skilled in areas of strategic litigation, advocacy, capacity building, and has been widely published. Next, we have Carmen. Carmen is the executive director of the Center for Justice and Accountability, which is an international human rights organization that works with communities impacted by international crimes to seek truth, justice, and redress through litigation and transitional justice strategies. She specializes in human rights litigation in national courts and has appeared as an expert on security, human rights, and accountability before governments and international bodies. I'll now turn to Mariana. Mariana is the managing attorney at Women's Link Worldwide, where she co-leads the organization's work in South America. She's a senior legal strategist and litigator, especially in reproductive rights and international gender crimes. She's also a law professor at the Ulster University of Colombia and has published legal articles and a book on gender-related issues. Next, we have Michelle. Michelle has worked in the international criminal justice field for 21 years and is presently the deputy head of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria. Prior to this, she was the deputy to the prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the Mechanism for International Criminal Tribunals, where she had oversight of legal issues across the Office of the Prosecutor. She brings extensive expertise on issues concerning gender and armed conflict, having co-authored 2 books and numerous articles on the subject. And last, but certainly not least, we have Mryna. Mryna is a Métis lawyer from Green Lake in Treaty 6 territory and the host of the Trauma Informed Lawyer podcast. Prior to founding her own legal services in 2019, Mryna served as an adjudicator in the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement claims process and as a Crown prosecutor with the Ministry of the Attorney General in Saskatchewan. In 2020, Mryna was awarded the Federal Department of Justice's first ever Excellence in Legal Practice and Victim Support Award. So what did I say? We have an incredible group of experts here. Thank you all so much for being with us today. So what do we mean by enhancing cooperation and representation among international justice actors? Well, when we talk about international justice actors, we're referring to the judges, lawyers, and investigators working within international institutions, such as the International Criminal Court or the independent impartial mechanism set up by the UN. We also have lawyers and advocates who work at international organizations and NGOs, as well as advocates and activists who work within national institutions and local NGOs. And importantly, we have members of affected communities, including survivors and witnesses who are involved at the grassroots level. Now, when we talk about cooperation, we're talking about the ways in which all of these actors interact. How do we engage with each other to ensure there's a true meeting of the minds? How and how often do we give each other space and attention? How do we respect the experiences and backgrounds that each brings to the table? And how do we recognize when collaboration sometimes means that one should cede power? And when we talk about representation, I think there are 2 meanings here. There's representation in the strict legal sense. How can legal practitioners best represent the interests of victims and communities? But we're also talking about representation of identities. Who do we see in these spaces? What power do these individuals hold? And are we seeing a true representation of the people who are most knowledgeable, most experienced, or most impacted by the very work we are doing? So with these definitions, the objective of today is to examine what intersectionality means in the context of working with survivors and affected communities, and how we can imagine a better way of doing this work. What are the structural barriers in current international justice systems that need to be removed? And how would a transformative, healing-oriented, intersectional form of cooperation among all of these actors look like? Now, one more thing just before we begin, I'd like to briefly point out a few logistical instructions. First, the chat function is open if you have general comments or would like to engage in a conversation without necessarily asking a question. On the other hand, if you have a question for any of the panelists, please use the Q&A function instead of the chat so that we can incorporate your questions at the end during the Q&A. For accessibility, we have live captions available on your screen. If you'd like to use them, you will need to manually enable them. And if you want to engage in this conversation on Twitter, feel free to tag @ICL or use the hashtag #ICL. And finally, a quick word on our code of conduct. We will not tolerate any comments or questions that are disrespectful, racist, misogynist, or otherwise inappropriate. So if you choose to engage in the chat or the Q&A, please respect these guidelines. Now, I'd like to finally turn to our first panelist, Carmen. When we think about spaces where international justice is practiced, we often think about international NGOs and nonprofits. And these are spaces where lawyers and advocates are most connected to impacted communities. And this is where they collect information, document, analyze, and repackage evidence to submit to national and international institutions such as the ICC and the UN. What are the problems that we're seeing in these spaces, and what does it take to build an inclusive practice that prioritizes the lived experience of survivor communities?
Great, thank you so much, Amanda, for the question. And thank you again to all the organizers for the invitation to take part in this really terrific series among such fantastic company. When I think about international NGOs and how intersectionality shows up in the space, I think it's along several lines. The first is when it comes to the makeup of the international NGOs and nonprofits themselves. Who's working at the organizations, and perhaps more importantly, who's leading those organizations. What identity and lived experience do the individuals working there have? Speaking just for myself, I am an East Asian woman in a leadership position at an international justice NGO. And I think while that brings a measure of diversity to the practice, I am still not truly representative of the communities we serve. So I grew up in the United States. I've spent most of my life in elite institutions. I speak for the most part a fairly proper English. I don't come from the communities that I am meant to represent. And I think the relative lack of representation of lawyers and researchers from impacted communities among our ranks in the international NGOs does impoverish our practice. We work in a field where context and cultural nuance is everything. It is what makes the difference in being able to obtain the trust of a potential witness or a civil society ally. It helps us understand what we're looking at when it comes to a piece of evidence, such as social media posts inciting hate speech using coded language. And so for those of us who are in a position to make decisions about recruitment, there is obviously a duty for us to think about representation when we recruit and when we hire. But I think it also has to start far earlier than that, from law school admissions to postgraduate fellowships and all the other stops along the way in developing a career in international justice. And for that to happen, there needs to be a certain amount of intention and deliberateness, both on the parts of those of us who work in the international NGOs, but also the people who fund us. So that's one way I think about intersectionality in the NGO practice. Another way I think about intersectionality in the context of the international NGOs is how we engage with impacted communities. So Amanda, in your question, you noted that it's the international NGOs who oftentimes are the ones who are most connected, or at least first connected with impacted communities, because this is where we collect our information, document, analyze, and repackage evidence, oftentimes to provide to international institutions. And so for me, that's actually part of the problem. The traditional model of how international, so-called international NGOs engage with local civil society is really one by which we simply collect what we need. And so in this case, this is the raw data from primary sources. And then we return home to do the work of refining that information into something that has more value, a dossier, a criminal complaint, a case file. And I think thankfully the field is starting to shift away from that, truly extractive approach, but not nearly quickly enough. And I do recognize that, of course, there is a certain level of training and expertise that is necessary to do things like document for legal accountability, to conduct the legal and evidentiary analysis, and to efficiently present this information to domestic and international institutions who are in a position to trigger some sort of legal proceeding. And the role of the intermediary and the mentor and the connector remains a really important one. So I'm not saying that like all of us should disappear, but I think that the work that we do in that space can be done more collaboratively. And what I mean by that collaboration isn't just in terms of making sure that human rights defenders from impacted community get credit for their work, but that we are also really intentional about things like sharing knowledge, sharing resources, by which I mean funding, and sharing access to power. So what can we do to allow our partners to speak for themselves? What can we do to make sure that local actors have the funding and the resources necessary to do the work that allows the international justice community access to the documentation that really forms the basis of any legal accountability effort? None of our work would be possible without this, right? And so one way to do it, as you mentioned in your opening, is to step back, right? It's to deploy your social capital to make an introduction to the decision maker, to make an introduction to that person in power, to make an introduction to that funder, and then to leave the room. It's about redirecting funds whenever possible. Or if you're seeking funding, to really be intentional about building in subgrants sufficient to support the work of the organizations you partner with. For the same reasons our NGOs can't work with no resources, our partners can't either. And oftentimes we are in a far better position to be accessing funds from the global north than they are. And it's about leveraging the positionality of international NGOs in the service of grassroots organizations. That's, I think, a question we need to constantly ask ourselves. What can we do to leverage our positionality in order to support the work of those that we call our local partners? And so I think the last thing I would just sort of say in this introduction piece is that an intersectional approach also reminds us that within the impacted community, not all voices are equally recognized. Historic marginalization and discrimination can also be replicated within civil society. And so women and religious, ethnic, and sexual minorities may often find themselves excluded from decision-making around accountability priorities or in terms of support from international actors. And so I think who we choose to engage with, who we support and champion, also demands an intersectional approach. So these are some of the reasons why I think intersectionality is so critical towards building a truly inclusive practice where lawyers and researchers and human rights defenders from impacted communities can really play a role in international justice processes, not simply as representatives of the survivor community, but as professionals and experts in their own right, who have true expertise to be able to contribute to this work.
Thank you very much, Carmen, for that. Does anybody else on the panel have anything they'd like to add to what Carmen has said? Or okay, so I think, Carmen, you spoke about the importance of interacting with survivor communities as professionals and experts in their own right. Mryna, my next question is for you, and it builds off of this statement. How do we do this while acknowledging that there's still a power imbalance in these interactions and that we're often engaging with traumatized individuals? What does trauma-informed lawyering look like in this context? If you'd be able to give us your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I was just reflecting on Carmen's words, and I was the one word that kept coming up for me as I was listening to Carmen speak was safety. That's something that I constantly experience, I would say, as an Indigenous lawyer who comes into spaces where I work with Indigenous people who have been largely, historically marginalized, othered, treated in dehumanizing and demeaning ways by justice actors historically. Like, that's been their experience. So when they come into legal processes, I immediately acknowledge that they are in a system imposed upon them.
Sorry, I think we have a technical issue here.
And so just acknowledging the failures and the truth of what it is that I am a part of, and being really, I would say, humble and open about acknowledging that although there have been these failures, that I'm committed to finding a better way forward, and that I am committed to prioritizing their safety and their empowerment, however that looks, and whatever that is, because it's different things for different people. And when you have a group of people who've been largely either marginalized or dehumanized or victimized, which I would say Indigenous women in particular in Canada, we're a demographic that we're constantly having to deal with things. Yesterday was February 14th. We were talking about in this country missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That is a subject that just needs to continue to be advanced, because there's not enough done, in spite of the fact that we had an inquiry, a national inquiry, we've had a report, we've had all these calls for justice. Nothing has happened on that. In my home province of Saskatchewan, I have colleagues who are dealing with the forced sterilization of Indigenous women that have happened as recently reported as 2018. So like, this is a lived sort of state of trauma that we're in, and anyone who's paid attention to what's happening in Canada around Canada's hidden genocide of what has happened to my people through the residential school system, it's really hard to look away from all the trauma and all the pain when communities are going back to the sites of former residential schools and discovering graves at those sites that further confirm that there were a lot of children who never made it home from those schools. And some might like to think it was because of disease or some other cause, but the fact is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has confirmed and heard that homicide occurred in those schools, and that's a truth that we all have to look at. And so recognizing that that is what Indigenous people need. They need safety, they need empowerment, they need personal agency, and they need us to be willing to look at what has happened to them, because I think their experience too often has been that as lawyers, as judges, as police officers, we're quick to look away, to minimize, to reduce their experience, to ignore the pain, or to take this position that they ought to be over it by now because it's historical, whatever that means. And so safety is a priority. And sometimes in my face, my Indigenous face, people immediately feel a sense of safety because I'm not white, I'm not male, I'm not what they normally see in these processes. But because I have a shared culture or a shared understanding or a shared lived experience, I immediately know some of the things that I can do to prioritize the safety of any victims or survivors of gender-based or intimate partner violence. And so it's as simple as just practicing self-awareness, like recognizing that if I haven't dealt with my own personal traumas, those traumas can collide with the traumas of the people that I'm serving. Secondly, I need to think about what I bring into those spaces and what I hold back. I have to think about my relationship to empathy and compassion and patience, and why those are critical competencies for lawyers who work with victims of any sort in any part of this large world that we live in. And because we don't compartmentalize as good as we like to think we do, we just don't. Our trauma travels with us wherever we go, and the traumas of others like to attach itself to us, and then we spread it wherever we go. And usually the first point of contact is in our own personal relationships in our homes. So recognizing boundaries and prioritizing safety. And that is very just a quick couple strategies for people. Think about where you sit in a room. Just imagine for a moment that everyone's experienced trauma, and I think that's not a stretch. given this pandemic that we're all living in. If people are living in trauma, their survival brain is kicking in, right? Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So if their survival brain is kicking in, they don't feel safe in a legal process. They don't feel safe with lawyers. Let's just assume that. They might want to sit next to the door because for them, that means an easy exit. And so if we mindlessly take a seat next to the door, that can increase the anxieties of the people that we're meeting with, because what they're hearing or what they're seeing is, I can't leave. As if I need to leave right now, I can't leave. And so I will say things to people along the lines of like, where would you like to sit? Where would you like me to sit? How are the lights in here? Are they too bright? Do you want me to turn them down? If I can open a door, I will invite them to decide whether the door is open, whether the door is closed. I give them lots of information about who will have access to their information, who they might see in the space, what's going to happen behind door number 1, 2, 3, and 4, and what all the possibilities are, because knowledge is power. And we know that for a lot of folks who come into these processes, they often aren't given the respect of being able to ask questions and to know what's going to happen if or when. And so I invite people to ask me as much questions as they can that allows them to develop a sense of safety. Like, am I safe in this process? What is going to happen if? And I think that once we give people that opportunity to gauge whether they could be safe with me and safe in this process, that will inform the relationship going forward. So I know that's lots of information, but I was just, thinking about all of the folks that I work with, and when they respond well to me, it usually begins there with this acknowledgement.
Thank you so much, Mryna. And you flagged a lot of details that are often overlooked. And I think this emphasizes the fact that we have to be very thoughtful in how we engage. We have to be careful and thoughtful in the planning and in thinking of not just the legal dimensions of the work, but the psychological dimensions of the work and how that can actually impact the work that we're carrying out and how effectively we're able to do it. Just very briefly, Mryna, you also mentioned previously that cultural humility is a relational approach. Could you expand on that just a little bit for everybody today?
So thanks for that question. I just want to flag or highlight that cultural humility is a concept I stumbled upon. It was, it's a concept, or I would say, it's a goal, a mindset. It's a mindset that was developed by Dr. Melanie Turvalon and Dr. Jan Marie Garcia. They're two Black physicians in the Los Angeles area. After witnessing the beating of Rodney King by members of the LAPD, they started to think about concepts like fairness and equity and justice and how they could bring that into the healthcare profession. And they critiqued concepts like cultural safety and cultural competence. And why they like cultural humility and promote it is because it's a relationship-based framework. And it acknowledges that whoever it is that we're dealing with is an expert in their own lived experience, to echo some of Carmen's words, right? And so that is why I promote cultural humility to go alongside of trauma-informed practice, because I would say that for a lot of folks who've been marginalized or have been othered or who've just simply been excluded in the legal world that I work in, there's a lot of benefit to starting to recognize and taking this approach that everyone is an expert in their own lived experience. And I think it serves lawyers really well to once a day say, I don't know. Because if we're committed to being teachable, there's so much that we can learn from people that we work with. And cultural humility forces us to also confront our own biases and beliefs about what we think we know, not just about other cultural groups, but also about survivors, how people respond to atrocities and horrific events, and what resilience is, and so many things. And so, in a nutshell, that is what cultural humility is.
Thank you so much for that, Mryna. It seems, as you've mentioned, and Carmen as well, that part of an intersectional practice is not only to center the lived experience of impacted communities, but to also be guided by their own understanding of what the harms are that they suffered, including how those harms themselves are intersectional. So I'd like to turn to Mariana, because you worked closely with Afro-Colombian women leaders on accountability for gender-based and race-based crimes committed during the armed conflict in Colombia. Can you share your experience as an example of intersectionality in practice?
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you for inviting me to the space. I have learned a lot in these minutes. In Women's Link, we are a transnational feminist organization, and our staff is mostly based in the Global South currently. So we are not the typical NGO with the INGO with the headquarters in New York or similar cities, but that doesn't mean that we don't face the questions about representations that we are discussing today. We use the law as a motor for social change, and we focus on women facing multiple inequalities. So of course, these questions and being truly intersectional is a key value and a learning process for us. We learn a lot from the two reports that, along with various Black women organizations, we presented together to the Truth Commission in Colombia. We actually presented two reports, and I was more involved in the first one, so I will speak more about that one. This first report, we did it with ASOM. They are the Association of Black Women from Northern Cauca, which is a place in Colombia where many Afro-Colombian communities lived historically. And they is an organization that was founded and led by these women. And we started, we met them with the hope that we could work with them on sexual and reproductive rights. That is one of our big topics at Women's Link. But then it came the first lesson we learned, that actually they were not that interested in working around that, because their political priorities and their organizational process was elsewhere. So it's the first lesson that you cannot go and impose an agenda on others, but you have to find, if it is possible, common ground. And in this case, it was possible, but it is absolutely key to be honest about your own interests and ask them about their interests and political agendas and advocacy objectives to check that there is alignment. And in this case, we agree that both organizations were interested in using the institution created by the peace agreement in Colombia to seek justice, truth, reparation for what Black women in Northern Cauca and their communities have experienced during the conflict. And I think an absolute key thing to this process was that this was not a standalone project or thing, that this was viewed for them as a piece of their organizational process. They were already in an organizational process that was strong and is stronger now, and the reports to the Truth Commission actually fit and strengthen their process, and that was key to success, I think. Another key thing was hearing them very loudly saying, we don't want the report only to be focused on the victimization, that of course is there, but we want also to tell the story about how we were they became leaders in this process during the conflict. They resisted to the violence, their impact not only in an individual way, but in their organization as Black women and in their communities. So before even we started to build in the methodology to collect the information, we knew and we agree as both parties that those were things we will respect and include and seek information in the report. And building the methodology was the next key step, and it is key, as has been mentioned here already, building collectively a methodology that was non-extractive, that took advantage of the skills the women in Assam they had, that strengthened those skills, developed new skills in them and in us, because we also learned in the process. It was not one way, but both ways. And it was in the recollection of the information. It was primarily young women from Assam that did the recollection of the information. They were the ones with trust within the communities, with knowledge about what happened. They were themselves victims of this violence and leaders in the resistance of this violence. And it was important that this work of them was recognized, even economically, and that the work, of course, is theirs. And then also, it was key when we collect the information and systematize them to present it in a report with the requirements of the Truth Commission and everything that was maybe where we at Women's Link had the technical knowledge to do it, but that we also wanted them to be involved in that, to before presenting the report to the commission, to actually ask the feedback of the people that we gathered the information from, presenting them the findings, saying this was what came out of the process we did. Do you agree with this? Is this an accurate representation of what you live? What changes do you want to make to this? And also that they were the ones deciding how to present this to the Truth Commission. And actually, it was really good. They collectively built the name of the report. The report is called Brave Voices, and it was a name chosen and built by them collectively. And in the image of the front page of the report was also drawn by Afro-Colombian artists. The women from Assam, they composed and sang songs about the findings of the report in the traditional music that was a form of resistance during the conflict. One of them even wrote a short story that is called the Princess of Silence, to present in another way the findings of the report. So I think that all of these were ways of actually do it in a way that accurately representing them. Of course, there were many bumps in these things we had to recognize could have been done better. But at the end, we are satisfied with the result, and they were really satisfied and own the process. So no matter what the Truth Commission says, the report is presented this year, and we hope these findings are included in the official report of the Truth Commission. But no matter what, this process helped them with their own collective process.
Thank you, Mariana. That's really helpful to hear some of the lessons that you learned and the ways that you engaged. And I think it's really helpful to also recognize that when the process is driven by the affected communities, we realize that what justice is, or what justice can be, is so much broader than just a very specific legal avenue. And it's important for us as legal practitioners to recognize that, you know, our role is just one small piece of a larger pie, and we're using a few available tools at our disposal, but there is so much more that can be done, and that needs to be recognized, and that needs to be invited into that process. I'm curious, because I know Carmen and Angela, you guys have also worked with, you know, within civil society in the NGO space, and sometimes directly with victims. If you have any of your own lessons learned that you might want to add, or if anything that Mariana mentioned resonated with you in particular.
I can just dive in. I think so much of what Mariana said absolutely resonated with me, especially you know, in thinking about how you can be deliberate and collaborative, and even designing the methodology with the groups that you're working with, to make sure that the interaction is one where everyone is benefiting. And where you know, skills are enhanced all around, where there is really a humility in terms of how we engage with you know, in what is essentially a knowledge exchange, right? I don't love the term capacity building, because it assumes that one side has the capacity and the other doesn't. That's never the case. There's always something that all of us can learn, and there's expertise in every interaction if you just look for it. So yeah, much of what Mariana shared really resonated with me.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. There's a lot there that I also have found in my own personal experience, especially the point about being guided by what they want. And as Mryna said, like, they are experts in their own lived experience. So perhaps, and you get this in strategic litigation a lot, which is something I've done, you want to set a precedent, you want to change every single situation that's going to come after your case, but sometimes that's not what the clients or the victims or survivors want. So it's adjusting your goals and ambitions to align with the needs and the desires of the people you purport to represent. It's very important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for pointing that out. I'd like to pivot slightly here and look at other spaces in which international justice is practiced. In addition to the national and international NGOs that work with impacted communities, another important setting is the supranational level. So this is the UN, the ICC, and other international investigative or human rights bodies. Michelle, I'd like to turn to you. You're the deputy head of the IIIM for Syria. This is, for those who may not know, the independent, impartial investigative mechanism for Syria, which was set up at the UN. How can the intersectional lens that we just discussed be applied to the work of criminal justice mechanisms such as the IIIM? And how does this enhance cooperation between domestic and international justice actors?
Thank you very much, Amanda. And I'm just checking everyone can hear me okay. Is it coming through? Thank you. Really very grateful to be able to take part in this discussion. And I was thinking about it last night, actually, that I have been a practitioner in international criminal law for over 20 years now. And this is definitely the first dialogue I've been involved in, specifically focusing on intersectionality. So I think it's fair to say that for international justice practitioners, it is a really long overdue conversation in our general field of practice. So really thanks a lot to the conveners of this series for such an in-depth exploration of the issue. And I'm certainly making a lot of notes and taking on board a lot of insights from what has already been said that will be of assistance to our work at the IIIM. At the IIIM, we have made a clear commitment to adopting an intersectional approach in our work, and we're now in the midst of putting this commitment into operation within the context of our quite unique mandate. And of course, it's at this point of trying to operationalise the theory of intersectionality in practice that we see up close, very close, where the challenges lie. And so a lot of the comments that have been made so far are definitely resonating around the need for humility and the need to really be finding those ways to engage with the affected communities around what it is that they really want. Those are things we're trying to do at the IIIM. It's definitely a work in progress, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. More generally, what I'm going to try and look at in my remarks initially is some of the practical aspects of integrating an intersectional approach into the work of an accountability mechanism. And it is quite new territory, I think, for many international accountability mechanisms and actors. And I'll look at how this is helping us in the context of IIIM's mandate to enhance cooperation between domestic and international justice actors. I feel like I should, though, just take a moment to talk a little bit about the mandate of the mechanism. I know some people will already be familiar, but many may not be. It is still a relatively new body created by the UN General Assembly in December 2016, really in the face of United Nations Security Council political deadlock on Syria. And so the mechanism was a way of trying to move forward to prepare for accountability when the other usual avenues at the international level were blocked. So the IIIM is described as having a quasi-prosecutorial function, and effectively it means we are doing preparatory work for justice. So we're building a central repository of information and evidence regarding core international crimes committed in Syria, and we're drawing material from hundreds of different sources, and civil society documenters are playing a hugely important role in this evidence gathering exercise, especially Syrian civil society actors. Also part of our mandate is analysing this material with a view to facilitating criminal proceedings now and potentially also in the future. So this is quite a complex equation actually to really focus on both short-term impact, but also preparing for the longer term in as yet potentially undefined or unestablished jurisdictions. And we're also actively sharing the material, including the analysis that we prepare with other justice actors who are actively working on Syrian cases. So the reality at the moment is that this is largely European war crimes units who are focusing on crimes committed in Syria. So clearly the IIIM is not the historical typical court or tribunal. It's not a court or tribunal at all, but rather it's a mechanism designed to facilitate justice. So it's very much a service provision mandate. And we support competent jurisdictions by sharing not only information and evidence, but as I mentioned, also analytical work, expertise from within our team, language assistance, and other forms of operational support. So this gives the mechanism a really unique opportunity to support other justice actors and to apply an intersectional lens to the investigation and prosecution of international crimes at the domestic level. So our aim is very much to embed an intersectional approach into the evidentiary and analytical work that we do, so that it makes it much easier for national justice actors who receive our work to also present an intersectional analysis in their cases. As I mentioned, we are committed to adopting an intersectional approach in our work, and we really see this as stemming from another commitment we've made to a victim and survivor-centred approach. And this is really our aim to promote inclusive justice for Syria. So as we started our work, we were very mindful of historical silences in international accountability work. And our mandate actually expressly highlights two of the most obvious, those related to gender-based crimes and to the experiences of children. So as part of our victim and survivor-centred approach, we see the need to adopt proactive approaches so that we can ensure these experiences and voices are not overlooked, and that obviously includes understanding the intersection of different systems of oppression. So we can see many different sites within our work at the IIIM where this intersectional approach is relevant. And perhaps the most straightforward relates to legal frameworks. And I won't dwell too long on this, but it's important, I think, just to flag it up front because it is an opportunity the IIIM is working to address. So I think most people will know that international criminal law has always recognised certain systems of oppression as drivers of violence. And these have related to things like nationality, ethnicity, race or religion in the context of specific crime categories that we work with, such as genocide or persecution. More belatedly, of course, other categories have been recognised, such as gender. So we have an important opportunity at the IIIM to make sure that we are fully leveraging the available legal frameworks to reflect intersectional harms in the work that we do. Beyond legal frameworks, intersectional factors such as socioeconomic status, marital or displacement status, often affect an individual's exposure to crimes and the impact of those crimes. And these we see as an important part of the factual matrix that we are developing in support of cases that we are assisting. These factors can, of course, also be relevant in establishing the gravity of crimes and the appropriate punishment. An intersectional analysis is also helping us at the IIIM to identify and address challenges in other critical aspects of our work, such as providing protection and support for witnesses and victims or survivors who we engage with. So we're working to ensure that our standard operating procedures and protocols relating to this kind of engagement account for both contextual and intersectional factors in each case. So all of this means that we need to have a really clear vision of the intersectional nature of the harms experienced by victims and survivors in order to adequately reflect them in our work. And this, of course, is a really complex undertaking, especially for an international body. In order to address harms flowing from oppressive systems, we have to be able to effectively navigate those same oppressive systems that silence individuals and obscure their experiences. And as we know, these systems are pervasive. So it's an ongoing challenge to be able to identify blind spots in our evidence gathering and the development of our contextual knowledge of the situation. And it really requires a high level of commitment and a very proactive approach. One of the key aspects of our proactive approach is continuous dialogue with victims and survivors, particularly through victim and survivor associations and NGOs, which the mechanism has prioritised from the outset of its work. And I think this is where we see another important development in the kind of mandate given to an international accountability actor like the IIIM, where we see a very clear emphasis on the need for a two-way dialogue between the international body and civil society. So the dialogue that we have takes place in many different ways. We definitely work very closely with NGOs on a daily basis in our collection of information and evidence to build the central repository that I mentioned and to provide feedback to the extent that we can about the materials we've collected. We also engage with Syrian NGOs and victim and survivor associations in an expert capacity. So we're really reaching out to them to seek input into the proactive strategies that we're developing on gender and on children and seeking their guidance in the development and implementation of this in our work. We also proactively seek input from local justice actors on strategic priorities and take this into account in implementing our mandate. So this is very much about that conversation around understanding what is important to those most affected, how do they want the harms presented, and what are the priorities that they would want us as a mechanism to seek to address. So a couple of very concrete examples of things that have come up for us in this respect. Initially, in our conversations with affected individuals and communities, we had a very interesting discussion around detention-related crimes in Syria and the most appropriate criminal categorisation of these crimes, with the affected individuals really seeing a crime category like torture being the most appropriate and not seeing one of the other crime categories that we would have initially started with, for example, persecution, being something that was a good reflection of the experience that they'd had. And through, I think, an ongoing dialogue and trying to understand the perspectives on both sides, I think we're coming to an increasingly sophisticated understanding of how best to put these types of events forward in terms of legal framework. I think another really good example is the issue of missing persons in Syria. It's not formally part of the IIIM's mandate. We are a criminal accountability actor, but we have definitely seen in our interactions from the very beginning of our work that the issue of missing persons was an absolute priority for those we are engaging with. So we have interpreted our mandate in a way that allows us to try and leverage the intersections between what we are doing on accountability work with the search for missing persons and try and support those mandated actors who are working on missing persons issues to the extent possible. So I just want to finish with a couple of observations about where we might look moving forward, especially based on my 20 years as an ICL practitioner. First of all, I would say it is really important that we find ways of moving the conversation we're having today beyond the echo chamber, beyond the people who are already engaged in thinking about this and putting it into practice. I think it's fair to say that it's not a conversation currently being heard by the majority of international criminal law practitioners, and we have a lot more to do to understand or help them understand why it matters and how it can be implemented in practice. And the last point I would make is the importance of starting early with our integration of an intersectional approach. It's so difficult to ensure inclusive justice if we don't start on this from the beginning. So we really have an important opportunity, I think, at the IIIM, still being a relatively new body, to set some important precedents on this. And as I mentioned, we really hope that this will be a foundation that other justice actors can build on in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Michelle. It's really great to hear from you and to hear about how the IIIM is applying an intersectional lens in a variety of ways, but also specifically by consulting with victims and developing thematic strategies. Does anybody have any thoughts they want to add? I see Angela. Did you want to add something? Okay, so I'll just move on to you then, because I think it's actually related. You know, in addition to these strategies that Michelle has so helpfully pointed out, I think going back to the original conversation we had around representation, it seems that an impediment to a truly intersectional approach to this work in international institutions is also the lack of adequate representation. So not just how we're doing the work, which is important, but who is there to actually do the work, and how does that enrich the way the work is being carried out. And by that, I mean, yeah, who's involved in the work at these institutions? What is the gender, race, geographical, and experiential makeup of those who are carrying out the work? So Angela, I'd like to turn to you. And I would love for you to share with us what you think are the consequences of inadequate representation in international criminal law institutions, and how these institutions can address this problem to improve their outcomes.
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you again to the organizers. It's been a pleasure to see how this series has unfolded. Now we're in the third webinar. It's very interesting, so I'm happy to be here with you all. So throughout the webinar series, webinar 1, 2, and 3, we've seen, Kimberly Crenshaw has been mentioned, and she coined the term intersectionality in 1989 in order to provide a multi-dimensional framework for anti-discrimination law in the US. And the idea was to acknowledge that discrimination of Black women was multidimensional and simultaneous on the fronts of race, gender, class, and of course, other forms of identity. And so she highlighted what she called, and I quote, the need to account for multiple grounds of identity when considering how the social world is constructed. And that's really what I want to do today in the few minutes that I have. And to answer your question, Amanda, what we do see in ICL and in institutions is a failure to appreciate intersectionality, which has manifested in poor representation. So when you look at the composition of teams and staff at international institutions, we need to ask ourselves these questions. Are there people of color? If so, how many and which positions do they hold? Are there women? If so, how many and which positions do they hold? Where are these people from? Are they from the global north? Are they from the global south? And what is the experience of the people who are at the intersection of all of these groups? So for example, a woman of color from the global south. What has the ICL world been like for you? Has enough been done to give you the recognition and the opportunities you deserve? Has enough been done to make sure that your lived experience is recognized as someone who sits at the intersection of these groups? And unfortunately, in the ICL world, the answer is not very positive. And take it from me, I'm a woman of color from the global south, walking these corridors and working in ICL. And I can tell you that it's been highly discriminatory on many of these fronts. So it's clear that a truly intersectional approach requires us to do better in this respect and appreciate that a failure to think or act in an intersectional manner has negative consequences. So before I get into the consequences and the possible solutions, which is really your question, I want to just set the scene a little bit. And I'm going to do this by referring to the ICC, because we have a lot of data that's come out there and a lot of information that's come to light because of the independent expert review. So I'll start with gender diversity at the ICC. So as of July 2021, ICC staff, 48.1% female and 51.9% male. Now that doesn't sound so bad. It's not perfect, but it's not bad. But when you dig deeper, you find that there's a much bigger problem because you have 81% women in the lower positions. So I'll just give you the numbers because it's shocking. At D1 level, which is the very top at the ICC, you have 1 woman and 8 men. At P5 level, you have 10 women and 30 men. At P4 level, you have 50 men, 50, and 32 women. So that just gives you a sense of the imbalance at the top. So sure, there are a lot of women who work at the ICC, but most of them have lower level positions. And the ASP report from the Committee on Budget and Finance does a very interesting comparison from 2016 to now. And if you look at those numbers, you'll see that very little has changed. In fact, in some situations, it's gotten worse. Let's talk about geographical representation at the ICC. As of 31 March, the stats show that there are 473 professional staff there. And of that 473, 256 come from Western Europe and other states. So that's essentially the global north. And that's the group they call the WEOG group. So that's 256. That's more than half of the professional staff at the ICC comes from the global north. 31 from Asia, 33 from Latin America and Caribbean countries, and 77 from Africa. So again, let's break that down even further. Let's look at who holds those positions. And you'll find that 55.6% of the D1 level positions are held by people from the global north. 72% P5 level and 56% at P4 level. So we're not just talking about diversity in terms of numbers, but we're also talking about diversity in the ranks. And now to really answer your question, the consequences of this, we see internal consequences and we see external consequences. And internally, we know that the ICC has a workplace culture problem. It's a workplace culture that is dictated, controlled, and determined by the majority, which in that case is white men. And we know from the independent expert review report that sexual harassment and bullying are rife in this environment, as is common in most male-dominated workplaces. So it's not a very inviting environment for women. It doesn't exactly inspire confidence for other women to apply. And of course, that affects the productivity and the happiness levels of the people who work within this institution. And that has consequences externally. So not only is it bad as a matter of fact, but it also doesn't look good. So we're talking about optics here, the optics of a workplace that is not gender balanced, of leadership that is predominantly white and male, doesn't reflect well on the court, which of course affects its legacy. We've all heard about the criticism of the ICC being a neo-colonial institution that's targeting Africa and other countries in the global south. Now, whether you consider that true or not is not the issue. The point is it's a widely held perception, and having all white male leadership is not helping us address this perception. So we're talking about the legitimacy of the court as well. The legitimacy of the court is at stake if this is not rectified. And as others have already mentioned, how cases are approached and how work is done. We've heard of the cultural insensitivity from fraught ICC outreach policies or investigative teams that are not diverse. Think of the impact this has on a witness or a survivor who's already in a vulnerable space. Never mind being questioned by someone who perhaps is too far removed from your cultural context to ask the right questions and to treat you with respect. So all in all, we see internal and external negative consequences, and it's clear that a lack of diversity and failure to appreciate intersectionality is really at the heart of many of the problems we see at the International Criminal Court. Of course, I have to mention that the ICC is aware of this and that there are initiatives in place to try and address this. They recently appointed a gender focal point. There have been attempts to change the recruitment policies, make sure recruitment panels are more diverse. There is a zero draft strategy on gender equality in the work and workplace culture at the ICC. They've hired external consultants to address the workplace culture problem, and there are mentoring programs, there are gender awareness programs, and there's unconscious bias training as well. So there are things that are being done, but I would argue that it's not quick enough and it's not enough. Because what we have now is the lives and experiences of women, people of color, and people from the global south that are not being accounted for in the legal agenda of the ICC. I could go on about the negative consequences, but I just want to leave you with a few recommendations. As has already been said by Mryna and Mariana, we have to be self-aware. We have to be intentionally conscientious, inclusive, and most importantly, humble. There are also a few very good recommendations from the 2021 UN Human Rights Council Advisory Report on the levels of gender representation. And it's basic things, better recruitment practices, truly diverse interview panels, job adverts that are inclusive in terms of language, And in the case of elected officials, minimum voting requirements or shortlists that are designed to address the imbalance. Another recommendation they have is setting aspirational mandatory targets for gender representation. So there's a lot of other recommendations that I'll go into, but I'll leave it there. And just to say, it's not just the ICC, it's not these institutions, but also the broader ICL community, NGOs, academics, scholars. Where are we on this issue? If you're an organization based in the global north, do you sponsor visas when you're hiring people? Who do you engage on Twitter? Who do you retweet and tag? Who do you follow? Who do you reference in your articles and blogs? Who do you quote? Who do you invite to speak on panels? Do they all fall into one demographic? So we should all be asking ourselves these questions, because in the end, all forms of inequality are mutually reinforcing. So we have to analyze and address them simultaneously. Thanks, Amanda. I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Angela. It was really helpful to get that statistical breakdown. I think it's jarring, even for those of us who know and have operated in these institutions and understand a lot of the problems with representation in this space. I'd like to open it up to the rest of the panelists if you have anything that you'd like to add onto this topic. Okay. What I'll do is I will also just flag to all of our audience that if you have any questions, there's a Q&A function at the bottom, and you should feel free to ask your questions there, because this wraps up kind of the panel portion, and we'd like to spend some time having a conversation and having this Q&A. What I'd like to jump into until we receive other questions from the audience is, I think something that connects the dots on a lot of what was said today is about power, right? About who holds power, how and when, and how do we ensure that that power is shared in an appropriate way. And it's easy to look at, externally at what we think holds power, the institutions we think hold power, the people at the top. But I think what I've heard through this conversation is that absolutely this conversation needs to happen at that level. And we need to talk about what it means to share this power, because there is an imbalance, both between justice actors, such as the lawyers and the advocates and the affected communities, but also within the space of justice actors and who the people are who are carrying out some of this work at these institutions. And so I'd like to pose the question to the panel, in your own experience and in your own view, how does one give up that power? Who should be giving up that power? Who truly holds that power in your experience? And if you could address that a little bit more.
I'll start, Amanda, and I'll talk about, again, at the ICC, actually many international institutions, especially ones that are based in the global north, where you find that they hire according to the financial contribution of states parties. So if your state does not contribute, then your nationals don't get hired. And this is a matter of public record. This is not a secret. And so then we're talking about, again, exacerbating the global north and global south divide. And who holds the power? It's those people who have the bigger wallets, the people who control the purse strings. And I think that's where the problem is, because if you don't come from a wealthy country that contributes money to establish new mechanisms, then your nationals will never be hired, you'll never get the work experience. And the same people will be moving from tribunal to institution to courts to various organizations, because they're the ones who everybody believes has the experience because they've come from wealthier countries. So I think we need to think about that as well. We need to think about whether this is a tenable framework to have, where institutions hire on the basis of financial state contributions.
I think just building on, Angela's comment about how money plays a role in the hiring. I mean, we live in late stage capitalism, and so money is tied to power. And I think across the board, you see how, decisions to fund impact representation all along the way. And so one of the things that we have been increasingly intentional about doing in the work that, in the work of CJA, is when we seek funding, we do make sure that it isn't all just coming to us, that we do carve out funds that can go towards supporting the partners that we work with as a redistribution of wealth, essentially. And I think that part of recognizing that in some respects, we may be in a better position to access money, puts on us a duty to be part of that redistribution if we can't otherwise, redirect it directly to others.
Thank you. I think that you bring up a very important point, both of you, which is about money and funding, which leads me to my next question. This was brought up earlier as well in terms of, how we are funded and who is funding us and where that funding is being directed. I know that in my own experience, in my own practice, it's really difficult to get funding for all of the necessary steps. As Michelle and others pointed out, there's a lot of thoughtfulness that needs to go into being careful about how we are conducting investigations, how we are even creating the methodology, how we are thinking about investigations and potential prosecutions. And it takes a lot of groundwork at the very beginning before even starting. And a lot of times funders don't necessarily recognize the value or the importance of that thinking period, that consultation period, that convening period to make sure that projects are set up and established early on with an intersectional approach so that the work itself can be conducted appropriately. So I'm curious to know from all of you, for those of you who have experienced fundraising, who have engaged with funders on these topics, is there a reception from some of the larger foundations or some of the smaller foundations or other sources of money? Is there an understanding that there needs to be a shift in acknowledging and accepting intersectionality in the preparation, the planning, and also in the execution and implementation? What have your experiences been like? Michelle, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Yeah, I guess I'm probably approaching this from a slightly different perspective to the others who are sort of more actively fundraising for their work. At the IIIM, we have regular budget funding from the United Nations, and we also have complementary voluntary contributions. So we have a combination of both. But what I wanted to mention is that I think one of the real opportunities that comes from a mandate like the IIIM's is that we have the luxury, in a way, of being able to think really strategically about the foundations of justice that we're building. Whereas I think a lot of courts and tribunals who are set up and expected to have the first indictment in court, the first defendant in the courtroom, don't necessarily have the luxury of being able to be so strategic. But because we are a justice facilitation mandate, we've been able to start our work really thinking very carefully about how we wanted to establish these inclusive foundations for justice. And we've messaged this in our public messaging on the mechanisms work right from the beginning. And I would say that at least at that very general rhetorical level, states and our funders routinely react positively to all of the messaging that we have around a focus on specific proactive strategies on gender, victims, and children. So I think that's positive, and I think in the context of our specific mandate, it's worked very well. I don't know how that translates to others who are under different kinds of pressure to move faster and sort of the funders may be looking at different kinds of metrics in that situation. So I'm curious to hear from the colleagues about how that works in practice.
I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but maybe Mariana or Carmen, I know you're both involved in this space. I'm curious if you have any thoughts.
I'll give the Carmen the pleasure to start off.
I mean, I think that one of the things that is encouraging is that we see many major foundations shifting their focus to the regional and the local. And their interest in really directly supporting local actors. And I think that is very encouraging. To the extent, to which we are seeing a truly intersectional approach, I think there are efforts, right? I think that there is an increasing interest in supporting women-led organizations. There are initiatives within the major foundations that go towards supporting organizational growth and leadership in organizations, recognizing that, organizations can't survive just with operational funds. They need to have, leaders that know what they're doing. And when you have leaders who are perhaps, non-traditional, that they might need more support. And so I do think that within the philanthropic community, there are efforts made. As with everything, I think more can always be done. And that's where I think sort of the intentionality comes in.
Yes, I agree with Carmen. There are some that are supporting like organizational efforts for organizations to apply an anti-racism approach and other like equity, so-called equity work within the organizations to change like policies, recruitment policies, and everything that Angela mentioned that should change at the ICC. Many of those things should also change in the NGO world. So, and that's a process. So yeah, there is some support to those efforts.
Thank you, Angela.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly add that, like Carmen said, there are efforts, more could be done, but you do also see philanthropic entities that won't just give money to one entity. If your project proposal or concept note doesn't include at least 2 organizations, one of which should be a grassroots organization, then you're unlikely to get the funds. So you do see that shift in terms of who are you partnering with and who will the money directly be allocated to, and are you really equal partners? And I think it's important for funders to have that in mind when they give money to some of the bigger entities. Is this money really going to trickle down? And if you make it a condition of the grant, then it's more likely.
Thank you. Yes, that's a really important point. And it does seem like, there needs to be a drive to change both within institutions, within NGOs, but funders have a role both in acknowledging and understanding what some of the barriers are, but in actually driving some of that change as well, because this is where the funding is and this is how people are enabled to do the work. So we have to, and I find this interesting as well when we talk about an echo chamber. Funders and philanthropists and people who work in that space really need to be a part of these conversations as well, in addition to other actors within these institutions. I'm going to turn, I believe we have a question from the audience, so I'm going to turn to that question. We have Fasika, who wrote, "We are women-based nonprofit in the New York area to bring awareness to the suffering of Amhara women and children in Ethiopia. Most are aware of the suffering happening in Tigray, but we lack representation. We struggle on where to start. I wonder if there is a similar case study that you can share. That would help us a lot. Thank you." So I guess my understanding of this question is, if you have individuals, affected communities who are looking to be represented, who are looking for support on how they can be engaged in justice avenues and justice initiatives, where does one start? How do they even know who to turn to, who to call, who to talk to? It seems like this is flagging also a barrier to entry in this space. And we see this a lot because you need to know or be known by an entity in order to be pulled into this and in order to be consulted and in order to have access to certain resources. What does one do when they're completely outside of this space?
I'll start. I think that's obviously a very particular situation. And I think it starts with looking around, where are you and who's around you? And sometimes it is easier to start with the bigger INGOs just because they have a bigger online presence sometimes. So if you do a Google search for specific organizations, and you'll then often find the organizations they partner with, and then it sort of gets more and more local when you start big and go down. So that's a way. I also find that Twitter is a fantastic resource, honestly. The entire human rights world and international criminal justice world is very active on Twitter, and that's where you get to know who's doing what and where and who you can contact. So that would be another way. Also, getting in contact with journalists doesn't hurt, just because they sometimes have connections or contacts or can raise awareness for your issue or your story. So I think it really just depends specifically on where you are and where you're based. And I mean, I'd be happy to bilaterally speak to whoever wrote that question. So just in case I can give some more specific guidance, but generally speaking, these are some of the tools to get some of the help you might need.
Well, and maybe building off of that and applying it to kind of more broadly, I guess, what is the role of outreach in the work that we do, and how do we think of outreach through this intersectional lens that we've just discussed? Because I think part of the conversation has been, being aware and open to communities, affected communities, and letting them drive the process, letting them decide what they want, what they need. And so in a way, we're being receptive, we're being reactive to the needs that are already identified within communities, but also those of us in this space, those of us here in this room, we have skills, we have resources, we have access, we have an ability to drive the justice agenda forward. So what responsibility do we have to actually outreach, and how does outreach look like when we consider and think about the intersectional issues that we've brought up today? Does anyone have thoughts on how to engage in outreach more effectively, more inclusively?
We can jump in with a few comments, Amanda. I'm reminded actually of something that Carmen said right at the beginning about how marginalisation can also be reflected within civil society. And it's something we've been thinking about a lot at the IIIM. As I mentioned, we collected broadly from hundreds of different civil society actors who've been documenting crimes in relation to Syria. And we've been looking through the material we've collected to identify gaps in the evidence. And we absolutely expected, and it has been the case, that there are glaring gaps when it comes to the voices of women, girls, and boys in particular. So I think it is a good reminder about that reality and the need for proactive outreach to try and fill those gaps. And that's something that we're working on at the IIIM. In terms of outreach, absolutely, it's so crucial. I mean, I think we learned those lessons even in the ad hoc courts and tribunals a couple of decades ago about the fact that you can't set up an international body and then not find ways of translating its meaning into the local communities. But from my vantage point at the IIIM, I think that conversation has really developed in a whole new way. And at the IIIM, we're definitely seeing outreach as one of the core functions that we have, the need to be able to communicate with those affected individuals and communities. And I think it's both to inform the work that we're doing, but also indeed as a way of ensuring participation in the processes. It's very easy to reach certain types of communities and individuals, but at the moment what we're really trying to do is diversify much more the outreach that we're doing and the scope of the individuals and experiences that we're reaching. So it's definitely a work in progress, but it's really crucially important to the success of any accountability process.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. One of the themes that came up in this excellent discussion today is the need to be aware of privilege and power dynamics and a willingness to yield power, whether that is in terms of financial power or giving the space for local organizations to direct and take ownership of the work. It is often the case that the yielding of power is not something that happens with willingness and can even result in a backlash and doubling down of privilege and power. Do the panelists have any thoughts on how we might achieve this shift, especially for those who are outside of this echo chamber?
That's a really good question. And I'm reminded again of something at the ICC, and this is also something that came out in the independent expert review report, was that tenure was one of the ways in which to address the imbalance. So they were suggesting that there should be term limits as we have at other organizations. So you can't be in your job for 25 years. You have to let go at some point and let somebody else take over, because you do hold that power. And for as long as, in the ICC's case, white men stay in their very privileged position, nobody gets promoted, and there will always be an imbalance at the top level. The question of how to shift that is very difficult, but I would argue that in some institutions, it is necessary to introduce hard regulations. So in this instance, tenure is a good idea. Limit the terms of people who are in certain positions. And it's very hard to do now because some people have been in their positions for very long. It's a very comfortable position and nobody wants to give it up. But I think going forward, it is something to consider, that when you establish these entities or institutions, try and make sure that there is turnover in the positive sense of the word. So nobody can be in that position for 10 plus years at the expense of someone else who is trying to rise in the ranks or is equally as good at doing the job.
Thank you. I see Mariana has her hand up, and I believe Mryna wanted to say something, so I'll leave the floor to both of you.
Thank you. I think there is not a magic formula. It has to come, the pressure, gentle or not, should come from like different sides. So to have like funders asking for accountability to NGOs or to international institutions on these, and also that we as leaders do it and have like awareness about like our own privileges and the need to walk this way, and then also like the local organizations and the grassroots partners, that they are also like asking for this, like, so the knowledge and empowerment of those organizations to ask for it, and as a condition to partner is also key, I think. So it has to come from different ways, I think. One only thing will not suffice.
Thank you, Mariana. Mryna, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, just quickly, I want to add, and I've been getting a lot of like, your connection is unstable, so I hope I don't freeze in the middle of this. Relationships. I think that we could also leverage relationships with people who are accustomed to being in positions of power and privilege. In my world, those people tend to be white men. And so I think that if we could leverage and commit to building relationships, there's a lot that we could teach people about so many things that they don't know that they should know, and even invite them to ask the question, what don't I know that I should know about some of the unique challenges that you face in this particular role? I know when I was a prosecutor, I would have loved that question, as being one of only 3 Indigenous women in the entire field in my area prosecuting. I think that if there's any takeaway for me from this conversation, I think that, you know, now is the time for humility. We all need to be asking the question, what don't I know that I should know in order to do this effectively? And also for counsel, and it's not lost on me that I'm seeing, you know, women showing up in this space doing a lot of this work, and in my world, a lot of women of color who are advancing conversations around race and trauma-informed practice and all of these other things, that if as employers, we don't put the resources in our workplaces to ensure that people who've been marginalized or disadvantaged or just historically othered, if they are not truly supported, which begins with what do what do I need to know that I don't know to help you succeed in this role? Like if we're not asking those questions and then putting those necessary supports in place, the people that we're bringing in that can bring that intersectional lens will leave, because either they're going to be burnt out or they're going to be subject to workplace violence or workplace harassment or just colonial BS that's going to make them want to like just say, you know what, you don't pay me enough for this job and I'm going to leave. And that's what ends up happening, is that people who are well suited to do this really critical work do not have the support, and then they leave because they're burnt out or they're disillusioned or whatever it may be. And so I think that relationships are critical, and education, in imploring people and convincing folks to get educated on subject matter that they are not educated about.
Thank you, Mryna. You know, that's really important. You brought it back to the issue of safety. And I think that's a really big and important point here, because as we often see, those who are left with the responsibility to raise these issues, or those who are recognizing, you know, the discrepancies and are the ones that would like to raise these issues, are often the ones who are themselves the most marginalized or vulnerable within the sphere that they're engaging in. And so there needs to be some safety for people to be able to speak out, to be able to try to leverage those relationships, to engage with their colleagues or with their superiors or with other actors in this space to actually bring these issues to light. So thank you very much for that. We have one last question that I'll just try to sneak in here, but it will be the last question because we're running out of time. And I'll leave it to anyone on the panel who'd like to respond, or if multiple people have comments. Thinking about cooperation and collaboration, the relationship between the ICC and civil society and states parties and civil society, these relationships have changed a lot since 1998. Would rebuilding it through an intersectional lens be something that could have the needed impact for the systemic changes that are needed? So would rebuilding, you know, the structures, and I guess this goes back to the question that the things that we're discussing today, they're structural barriers, they're systemic issues. So if we were to apply an intersectional lens, how can we bring about the systemic changes needed to improve these structures and to be able to have more effective institutions? I think, honestly, I think we've been discussing this the whole panel. So I think we've basically answered this question, but perhaps if anyone has any last thoughts or any last reflections on this topic before we wrap up the panel.
I'd just say very quickly that, you know, I think it's what we've all been saying, which is just we need to, better representation for me is key, because then you bring in people who have a different perspective and who can cover some of your blind spots. And so you need to get more women, you need to get more people of color, you need to get more people from the global south, you need to have more people who are not from an Ivy League or from not an Oxbridge person. You need more diversity in every sense of the word. Otherwise things don't change.
I mean, I think for me, Mryna really summed it up with, you know, no more of this colonial BS. We need to decolonize the practice. And that's, if we're talking about structural change, I mean, that's really what is at core here.
Amanda, just a final thought from me, and I think it has come out in the discussion so far around, I mean, you mentioned it actually, just about the painstaking work that's needed in every aspect of the institutions we build and the practice that we develop, if we're really going to address this priority in terms of intersectionality. And I think that is really our experience at the IIIM. I mean, it's not a question of sending an investigator out into the field and saying, collect intersectional evidence. I mean, it starts from the very moment that you recruit your first person within the team, and it continues through every aspect of the practice thereafter, which is why it is such a challenge, because it requires constant effort and it does require time. But there's no other alternative if we want inclusive justice, that's for sure.
Any last thoughts, Mariana or Mryna? Okay. Well, I really appreciate all of your reflections and everything that you mentioned. And I think ending on the note about decolonizing this space, I think is really important. And I think we need to also recognize that international law itself and international criminal law itself has historically been a colonial tool. So we need to not only decolonize our understanding of international law and international criminal law and recognize the limitations of this tool, but we also need to decolonize how we engage with it. And it's a very complex and broad topic, and it can certainly be the topic of a whole other discussion that we have. So I'll leave everybody here on this note, and I really just want to thank all of you for being here today. Everyone has provided such interesting and unique perspectives, and I think we're all richer from having been here today and listened to your thoughts and your insights. So thank you to our audience. And this panel has been recorded, so if anybody would like to access it later, you can access it online. And with that, I will say goodbye to everybody. Thank you. Take care.